Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly one-hour Berkeley Boost webinar. My name is Jim Gilbert, and I'm the Director of Executive Education at Berkeley Law. It's wonderful to have you with us this morning. Thanks for joining. For those of you who would like MCLE credit for this webinar, please be sure to complete the form that you'll see on the next slide. The link is tinyurl.com/Berkeley Boost -engagement. Again, that's tinyurl.com/Berkeley Boost -engagement. Once you complete that form, we'll ask for your name and bar number. You will receive a certificate of attendance at the conclusion of the webinar. Berkeley Boost is just one part of our larger executive education platform. We provide a number of different ongoing programs throughout the year. At the moment, all of our programs are online, so you're able to participate wherever you are. You do not have to be in the Bay Area or come to campus at the moment. One course I want to tell you about is our Sustainable Capitalism and ESG program. You'll be learning more about this later on in the presentation this morning, but it's our newest Exec Ed online certificate program that launches August 19th, and registration closes for that on July 30th. We also have our upcoming General Counsel Institute. Again, this is an online program. It will be taking place over 4 Thursday mornings in August. This is a program for mid-career in-house attorneys who want to gain insight into the skills, techniques, and disciplines of the general counsel role, as well as network with other up-and-coming legal executives. And finally, I just want to mention our next Berkeley Boost webinar that will take place on July 29th. The topic of that webinar will be remote work and contingent worker issues. So with that, we're ready to begin our presentation this morning, which is focused on investor engagement on racial justice. If you have questions for our guests during the presentation, please use Zoom's Q&A feature. Submit your questions. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Amelia Miazad. Amelia?
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to our audience for being with us today. I am looking forward to exploring a lot of territory and a lot of new territory. We have a lot to cover in just 1 hour, and we have 3 extraordinary guests with us today. So I'd like to get like to get started. The roadmap for today are, we're going to start with introductions, but within those introductions, I'm going to ask our guests to, at a high level, discuss the nexus of their investment strategy and racial justice. And then we're going to touch upon the outcomes of systemic racial inequities on markets and on access to capital. We're going to look at how investors are looking outward at their portfolio companies to try to bring about change. But we're also going to look at a more recent trend, which is investors looking inward to see how their own policies and practices are furthering racial injustice. And then I'm going to ask our guests to make some predictions about the future. So let's get started with that. I'd like to start with Kimberly Lewis, the Director of Engagement for Federated Hermes International. Kimberly, can you tell us about Federated, about the scope and scale of your practice, but then also about the nexus of Federated's approach to asset management and racial injustice?
Sure. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. Just a bit of background. I sit on a team called EOS, which stands for Equity Ownership Services of Federated Hermes International. And so what this team does is we are not asset managers ourselves. We are a stewardship provider, and we provide voting and engagement services on behalf of not only Federated Hermes International, but we have over 40 other clients representing over $1 trillion in what we call AUA as opposed to AMA, assets under advice. So what we do in our stewardship team is we do proxy voting. So we vote on behalf of all of our clients, or we recommend votes to our clients on key ESG issues. And then we also engage our companies. We do active ownership. So throughout the year, we meet with our companies on, we have our priorities divided into 16 themes, falling some under E, S, G, and then also we have another bucket for sort of long-term strategy and corporate culture. So we spend a lot of time with boards of directors and with CEOs and executive teams, really looking at what we think are the drivers of long-term sustainability. All of our clients, asset owners and asset managers, are long only, and so sustainability is a core part of their investment strategy. So as far as ethnicity, so it's interesting because race and ethnicity falls within a number of our themes, actually. Mm-hmm. We've got a board composition theme under governance, where ethnicity plays an important role in terms of board composition. Mm-hmm. So we vote and engage, depending on the region, on ethnicity. Also our human capital management. So through our human capital management theme, we're looking at the company's human capital pool, the diversity of it, not only the numbers of diverse employees, but also the career experience. We're looking at things like executive team, leadership positions, where people of color, Black people sit in the organization, and as well as other ethnic minorities. And it also falls into conduct culture and ethics. And we're really interested, and we engage companies on how the board oversees the culture of it, how the culture is perceived by its employees of color, and then also in terms of long-term strategy, how its products and services are impacting communities of color. That's the short version.
Thank you for that high-level overview, and I look forward to exploring those engagement strategies with you in a few minutes. But before I do so, I'd like to introduce Melanie Mendoza, the Chief Compliance Officer of Matarin Capital. Melanie, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Can you tell us first a little bit about Matarin Capital, its history, and its unique philosophy with respect to investment, and then a little bit about your role and the nexus between the compliance function and investing that advances racial justice?
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so Matarin was founded in 2010, July of 2010. There were 3 co-founders. And today the firm, we're up to 8 employees, and we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, which is a great milestone to have. Matarin, so different from Kimberly, Matarin is an investment advisor. We were registered with the SEC in 2013, and we have a quantitative investment process. The investment team has worked together for decades. There are 3 members of our investment team, and they have worked on this quantitative process at previous firms. Matarin, when it was founded, and to this day, we strive to be a symbol of stewardship for our clients. Now, we are an institutional investment advisor, so we have 100% institutional clients, with the majority representing public pension assets. So, there is a certain fiduciary duty and stewardship that involves managing these assets for public employees to use, to survive on down the line. My primary role as CCO at Matarin is, of course, to ensure firm-wide regulatory compliance. I won't go into the detail. We are regulated by the SEC, so there is a lot that goes into in terms of, policies and procedures and code of ethics, which all runs along the same lines as the stewardship of the firm. But since we are a boutique firm, it gives each of us an opportunity to engage and participate in other special projects going on at the firm. So I guess the last 2 years, I became involved with our ESG program, and we are new signatories to the UNPRI. So I worked on that and worked on the whole reporting process of that, which can be cumbersome. but also on the race, and most recently on racial equity investing, working with Glenmead Trust in producing this report, which was it was a great experience for me, and also being able to join this group. In terms of the nexus of my role as CCO and Matarin, I just wanted to give a little bit of background information. Mm-hmm. So my colleague Neely Gilbert testified in front of Congress May 19th, 2019, and the topic was having the SEC make it mandatory for firms to disclose information on their human capital. As quantitative investors, it's very hard to come up with data, a data set to be able to perform comparisons for our investing. So the SEC in 2018 started sort of a voluntary process for an assessment of firms, companies, to disclose their human capital. Mm-hmm. To date, only 5% of firms have participated. So as you can see, there's a long way to go. The data sets are not great. So as my role as CCO and my involvement with the SEC and on the regulatory side, I hope to build on that role at Matarin and with the SEC to push this agenda further along.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Melanie. And there's two things that we're going to touch upon, which is a terrific report that you helped advise on, but also data, which is something that I've discussed with Kimberly, and just the opacity and the lack of access to human capital management data that investors have. And so thank you for your engagement on that issue and your advocacy for more disclosure. With that, I will ask Doug to introduce himself, a very different perspective, but a very unique and innovative perspective as well. So Doug, welcome to the discussion, and tell us a little bit about Newday and your role and approach to investing.
Great. Amelia, thank you very much. And it's a real honor to be participating with Berkeley Law today and sitting alongside both Melanie and Kimberly on what we view as an incredibly important issue. So Newday Impact is essentially a breakthrough technology platform that brings education, analytics, and investment opportunities to what we characterize as the mass market. And so I come from the traditional wealth and asset management side of the business, having spent 20 years plus in leadership positions. And one of the challenges that we witnessed over a long period of time is that most of the bulge bracket institutions had historically shut out individuals with lower levels of financial affluence and influence from impact opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so our platform was designed to do that. And so what we do today is that we've built a set of what are 8 impact investment strategies around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we provide access to those strategies, thematic strategies, a lot of education alongside that, for a minimum of $100 that gives broad diversification across that set of strategies.
So an individual can invest at a minimum of how much?
$100 today. Okay. Yep. And we're giving actually consideration to reducing that minimum. When we launched the platform a year and a half ago, we allowed people to come in at a $5 level. Mm-hmm. But I'd also like to acknowledge those in every community around this world today that have suffered from oppression and discrimination, as the core of our work is really focused on this idea of transformational change regarding how people make decisions pertaining to social and environmental issues. We are not only mindful of the social upheaval occurring right here in our backyard, but we are determined as an organization and through collaboration with other organizations like the firms that are on the call today to put new innovative solutions into action. In improving economic inclusion for all members of our community, we view as a societal obligation. It is also an absolutely critical step to supporting the future economic livelihoods of our underserved communities, which we'll talk more about today as the discussion goes on.
Thank you so much for that, Doug. And so let's turn to that. Let's turn to the outcomes of systemic racial inequity from the terrific report that we've shared and that we'll chat out that Melanie worked on and that was published early July called Racial Inequity Investing. And that report outlines the outcomes of systemic racial inequities. And here are some of those outcomes that we're all familiar with. But I wanted to just open up the discussion to each of you with respect to how your work addresses some of these outcomes, starting with looking at engaging with companies, and then we'll move to looking inward. So Kimberly, maybe we'll start with you. Sorry, Kimberly, I think you're on mute.
Apologies.
No worries.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I was trying to figure out my new screen here.
Sure. So this is from the report that Melanie helped advise on, and it just outlines some of the outcomes of systemic racial inequities. And I wanted to hear more in a little bit more detail. So drawing upon the themes that we chatted about a couple of minutes ago, what is your engagement strategy? How is your engagement strategy focused on these outcomes?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, and apologies.
No.
Yeah, so to be completely candid with you, we are really in a process as a result of sort of the crises and the movement over the past few weeks. It has really required us to take a fresh look at our engagement around racial inequity. Mm-hmm. Now, as I mentioned previously, we had been doing this on a broader level, looking at composition. Our engagement around racial equality more focused on, as I mentioned, composition of the board, composition of the executive teams, kind of looking at where Blacks and Latinos and other ethnic minorities sit in the organization. But it did focus less so on our product and services. That's something that we're really looking at doing now and increasing our engagement on, is really as a result of kind of listening and kind of going through the process that many of us are now on, kind of taking a closer look at our activities and how it's impacting the wider society. So now, we have been having discussions internally on how to measure and how to gauge the impacts that our companies are actually having on home ownership. So, for example, we have always engaged financial institutions on things like community lending and where, how involved is it? We're very well aware of the what it's doing on financial literacy programs. We do a lot of engagement around the SDGs and reduce inequalities, looking at companies, requesting that companies kind of report their activity against the SDGs, which then gets at, the health gap, home ownership gap, wealth and employment. But to be candid, we do need to dig deeper into the impact on actual communities. Historically, I think, that's not an area that we've given enough focus to, and we're looking to do that more.
When you say products and services, can you give us some concrete examples of that? So it sounds like that's an area that you weren't looking at before, but you are now. What are some examples of that work?
Yeah, I'll say we're sort of reshifting I'll say we're ramping up our engagement in that area. So, for example, let's take the financial services sector. Mm-hmm. So we have been engaging for retail banks, we would be engaging on community lending and looking at what they're doing in the community, predatory lending, looking at its products and services. We have historically been engaging on that. We've been looking at whether or not and encouraging them to not fund private prisons, for example. That's something we had been doing. We have been doing work in product and services, but now we're looking kind of broader than that. That had mostly been in the financial services sector, and also in those that are highly exposed to environmental risks. So if there were manufacturing sites, water stress in certain areas, how kind of environmental racism and those sorts of implications. So we're kind of mapping out by sector where we have been engaging. So for consumer goods companies, we have been engaging on access to nutrition. We have been engaging on sugary and salt products. We have been engaging on sustainable food sources. And so what we're doing is looking at our engagement activity and how what we've been in, where it is impacting communities of color more, and that good work, but then also looking at where we're not and where we should be.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna bring Melanie into this discussion. I know for the past 10 years, and happy birthday to your firm. You know, you've been similar to Kimberly, engaging on these issues. Can you tell us what's changed recently? How have your priorities changed in the past few months, and what are you looking at into the future?
Sure. And I just, again, we don't engage with companies the way Kimberly's firm does, since we are a quantitative manager. But, you know, part of the investment process, which is always being not changed, but it's always being enhanced as time has gone on. But there's always been 5 principles of the investment process. And one of them is, you know, how our firm uses the algorithms to look at shareholder-friendly leadership and the people of the firm. So they're looking at you know, the record of adding value through capital allocation. They're looking at, you know, the diversity of the firm, of the board members. You know, try to avoid empire builders, looking for good corporate governance, and investment in innovation in terms of the people. We actively research with other groups, for instance, ISS or Perio. We look and engage with other academic studies and McKinsey on how to create this database to standardize reporting, because without the standardized reporting by every firm, it is hard to build a quality data set in order to do what Matarin needs to do to move forward in terms of, you know, racial equity, making sure that what we see is accurate. I mean, it's all about, right now, we just, you know, we trust firms to disclose correctly, you know, and there's an issue with how, you know, how people see themselves in terms of racial and ethnicity standards, and it could change from one firm to the other. So until we get those standards in place, you know, that's what we're working towards. You know, at the end, it's all about human capital, and we have to get the SEC and EEOC online to help advance this.
Okay, so I'm gonna, in a moment, turn to disclosure and data on human capital and ask Kimberly that question, because I had an illuminating discussion with her about that recently. But I'm gonna now move to Doug and ask you the same question. How has your focus and strategy changed in the past few weeks following the tragic killing of George Floyd?
Thank you, Amelia. It's a strategy that continues to evolve, and much of the work that we do as an organization is really centered on this idea of transformational change. So I'd like to address this question from a couple of different perspectives. So we, in our platform, deliver education and provide impact investment opportunities for individuals that are seeking to identify organizations that are trying to move the needle in meaningful ways. And so, as an example, we're in the process of creating what is a racial justice portfolio right now that will be available in the next couple of months that I can talk more specifically about. But we are evaluating more than 80 individual sub-factors associated with the work, not just policy writing, but how organizations are specifically putting into practice these important aspects of racial equity.
So I'm gonna just pause and interject really quickly, well, I'm not going to ask you to go through all 80, but can you give us a sense of what those metrics look like?
So let me talk about one which I think is oftentimes overlooked. What's absolutely critical is we're trying to advance a group of individuals that are looking for better job opportunities through corporate America, especially with larger organizations, is job training. And so how are we bringing people into an institution, giving them adequate opportunities to build their skill set so they can be highly successful in that new role? We look at all of the other aspects that I'm certain that Kimberly and Melanie are looking at as well in terms of board diversity, employee diversity, and things like that. We look at a vast number of other issues around controversies, so like EEOC violations and things like that, all that are incorporated in the methodology that we build to include those organizations in our portfolios. The other thing that we're trying to do as an organization is really to tilt capital towards those organizations that are doing good work. And it's not just specific to corporate organizations, but we, as a B corporation, are aligned with a nonprofit organization or NGO on every one of the strategies that we run. So we're taking 5% of our revenues and contributing back to those organizations so that they can continue to do the deep impact work that they and only they can do. The third aspect of this is really about access, which is where this conversation started today. That historically, underserved members of the community have not had access to financial services the same way that people of higher levels of affluence have had. And so this is why we built the platform, so that we are leapfrogging above and over the traditional financial system, so that we're not putting people that have never worked in the financial system in a position whereby they feel threatened by going in and speaking with a retail banker or a stockbroker or a financial advisor. And as such are significantly compressing the fees down in access to what is now investment, but ultimately what will be savings opportunities, and then finally credit opportunities for those people.
Okay, thank you for that. And I wanted to now turn to Kimberly and talk about data and metrics. You know, as Melanie discussed, there are very few companies that disclose. As someone who regularly engages with corporate boards, you know, what is your strategy with respect to encouraging more disclosure? And do you feel that there is enough access to the data to require that disclosure?
Thanks for the question. And yes, it's something feels very strongly about, as you know. So I'll answer it in a couple of ways. First of all, at the board level, and now I'm speaking of ethnicity generally. There's absolutely kind of no reason in the US why a company should not or not be able to disclose the ethnicity of its board. To be fair, most companies do this. However, there are also many companies that kind of obfuscate it, don't have pictures on the board, or they'll say, well, we won't give you this data because it's not you know, it's not our place to say. Or I mean, there's always kind of sometimes there's a plethora of reasons why something that's inherently not very difficult is sort of made difficult. We are encouraged to see that there are a number of public policy projects designed to encourage boards to affirmatively disclose. ISS is doing work on this, encouraging companies to disclose the ethnicity of their boards. I know there's some work ongoing in the SEC. There's some legislation on the Hill. It just shouldn't be that difficult in the US. So what we will do is we actually use visual identity to identify a board. So we actually do go through during AGM season and actually look on the website or look for some indication of what the ethnicity is. And in many cases, it's not hard to find. The board member themselves has disclosed somewhere their ethnicity, or members of certain organizations that make that apparent. But it shouldn't require that. So there should be much more transparency around ethnicity on the board. And executive team as well. Now, throughout the organization, and this is where the US, absolute companies really have no excuse. And that's because of the EEO-1 form that all companies must fill out every year. So every company over 100 people must complete a form that has that's an x-axis and a y-axis. It is gender, ethnicity, by sub-ethnicity groups, Blacks, Latinos, etc. And then it has job category. And each company must report the numbers of employees in each of these categories to the Equal Opportunities Commission every year. So this data is available literally at the press of a button by any company. So there have been calls which we support by company. Now it is confidential when you submit it to the Equal Opportunities Commission, but there have been calls which we completely support to just simply ask all companies to publicly disclose their EEO-1 data. There's no reason not to. Now some companies will say, well, the categories don't really suit our business model, which is a legitimate. So there's categories such as kind of laborers, I think, and that may not suit all sectors. And in that case, we simply say, well, that's fine. Report in sectors and categories that work for you. So we're hoping that part of the result of the movement that we're seeing is that investors will continue to put more pressure on companies, and companies will not be able to hide between sort of lack of data or lack of transparency around data, because we really should be beyond that in the US.
So stepping back a bit, tell us, why is this data important? Why is this data important for advancing racial equity? And then my second question is, why the reluctance if it's so accessible? So 2 questions for Kimberly, and I'll bring Melanie into the discussion, and then we'll talk about some other strategies.
So, sorry, the first question is why the reluctance? Why is it important, and why the reluctancy? The data is important for a couple of reasons. But one, and I'll certainly kind of defer to Melanie and Doug, who are actual investors, on how it can be used. But from our perspective, it really gives us some insight into how the company, from a long-term perspective, we want to know, not necessarily, we do want to know what the demographic makeup of the company is, but we really want to know what's the data now, and where do you want to be? Have you set goals? Have you set targets? Do you have metrics to measure whether or not you're seeing improvements in or not? We want to know whether you have ethnicity captured in your engagement studies, whether or not you're measuring, whether or not you're looking at reasons why people of color leave. We know for women, for gender, there's generally a leaky pipeline, and that you tend to see a gender pay gap because women are underrepresented in lower paying positions and in lower less senior positions, and underrepresented at the top. We know that through data. We know that hypothetically through ethnicity, but we generally don't have the data as we do for gender. So it's important to see not only where a company is, but know that it's got aspirations to do better. And the hesitancy, I suspect in many cases that the data doesn't look very good. And the message that I would have for companies is that it's actually okay if it's not good. What we're looking at as stewards or engagers on behalf of long-term investors is we're looking at that we're going to see progress in this space over time. That over time, as we hold these investments, that your human capital pipeline will be more diverse and will reflect the products and services. And we know of the data, and that you are aware of the correlation, the demonstrated correlation between ethnic diversity and gender diversity and financial performance. So we're looking for long-term trends. So what we encourage companies to do is say, look, disclose and have a plan. If you're not, we're not going to sort of ding you if it's not a sort of a pretty picture right now. We'd rather you disclose and be transparent than sort of obfuscate. And I think that's being heard more now than it has been.
Melanie, now turning to you as an investor, what are your thoughts on why is the data important to you?
Yeah, I would go back and I agree 100% with everything that Kimberly has just said. Actually, she took some of my bullet points, which is great. But it's important to us both as on the investor side and also as a minority-owned firm itself. You know, in order for us to invest our clients' assets and to enhance, you know, to forward this whole process towards racial equity, we absolutely need the data, and any sort of quantitative firm needs it. And even, you know, a fundamental research-based firm also needs that data within a firm. Now, you know, board diversity, I think board very slowly, they're starting to get more women and people, non-whites on board membership. And it's funny because now that they're doing it, it becomes news. You know, that shouldn't be a news flip. It should just, you know, happen naturally. But also within the firm itself, you know, you never know where the next good idea is going to come from. So having cognitive diversity at, you know, at upper management level is very important within a firm. So that's why, you know, in the disclosures, you know, how they, you know, rank different diversities at different pay levels, and whether they're manager, VP, however their firm is organized, it's very important because from the outside, a firm can look like, oh, they have 40%, you know, diverse people within the firm, but, you know, at what level? I think that's important across the board. Now, as Matarin being a minority firm, and I've worked at 2 other minority firms in my past, in the investment advisory. So this is specific to the investment advisory industry, but you know, there were programs that were started back in the early 80s to help minority and emerging managers actually receive assets and allocations from these large public pension plans because they weren't getting any before. So this was started back in the 80s, and it's still, to this day, I think maybe minority managers make up about 1.3% of the trillions of dollars of retirement assets out there. And, you know, today there are still, even just this year, a number of minority firms had to shut their doors. So shutting the doors, or maybe they're being, you know, absorbed into another larger firm, which could possibly mean they lose that minority classification. So, yeah, it's very personal and important to our firm and other minority firms out there to get more, you know, find a door to getting more assets, because, you know, it sounds like a big allocation if a, you know, a $1 trillion pension plan is offering, you know, 500 million to minority managers, it's nothing. So,
So, Doug, turning to you on the same question, how do you look at diversity, and then talk to us about in your investment strategy?
Yeah, of course. And I just want to say that, Melanie, the work that you're talking about in terms of allocation of assets to minority managers is critical.
Absolutely.
We should talk about that further. I spent some time this week with a gentleman that's advocating for that in Southern California through some of the major pension funds down there. So maybe just for a moment, let's set aside this idea of what's required to do versus doing what's right, because none of us would argue that the idea of building a diverse organization makes sense. The first thing that I think about, and that we think about as investment managers, is consumer trends right now. So we have this massive generation of younger people that are measured 85 million strong right now, that care about values alignment more than any other generation. And they are voting with their dollars right now. They already represent 40% of the American purchasing power right here in the US. And so they are telling corporate organizations that we are going to direct our consumer purchases, our investment dollars towards organizations that are behaving responsibly. So that's point number one.
And a number of them are on this call right now. So thank you, and keep going.
Yeah, so the second part of it is really core to the work that we do as an institutional investment manager, and that is around driving alpha. And so the fact of the matter is that organizations that are making responsible decisions associated with environmental, social, and governance characteristics are outperforming their peers in measurable ways. They've got a lower cost of capital. They've got stronger operating performance, and oftentimes their equity is outperforming. So this is all about identification of great companies, and great companies are companies that leave a lasting imprint on the communities in which they're living and operating in. And so, you know, we have this adage in our organization that ESG is critically important, but a decade from now, our belief is that it's just going to be the way that all decisions are made, because it's almost impossible now to overlook the characteristics associated with alpha generation for organizations that are pursuing that.
Thank you for that. And I have a lot of hope, given that the investors of tomorrow see an alignment between value and values. I wanted to turn now to systemic risk, something that we've heard a lot about with respect to so many things that are happening in ESG right now, but also with respect to racial justice being a systemic risk. How do you view that framing? And why don't we start with you, Doug?
Sure. So fundamentally, improving economic inclusion is going to help us address social inequities and better equip not just Black individuals, but other underserved individuals and families to build a stronger financial foundation in a more resilient future. Economic inclusion, which we are so focused on today, would provide poor families and individuals with the opportunity to improve their standard of living by providing access to modern financial services, including access to savings, to credit, to insurance, payment processing, as well as sufficient education to support them in making better financial decisions going forward. So the whole idea of bringing people into the financial services community and the capital markets community can't be emphasized enough, that the increase of choices there is going to help the wealth gap, the income gap, in building a stronger middle class.
Well, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, Doug, and that's the fact that Black and brown communities have been historically subject to a lot of injustice in the access to capital and access to credit markets. And fintech companies have been criticized for that as well. So the question really relates to trust. What is your company doing differently to acknowledge that history and reality with respect to those historic practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are trying to do things differently. And from the day that we started this organization, we are trying to build a community of employees and of clients that look like the rest of the world. Our employee base is 75% diverse, characterized by women, persons of color, LGBTQ. Our board as an organization is 69% diverse. Our advisory board is 55% diverse. So it's critically important that we walk the talk, number one. One of the things that happens in the impact community and investment community today is that a lot of people talk about impact, but the mere exchange of a security or a company that may be doing well from one investment holder to another doesn't create impact. So you've got to be out there actually working with these organizations to affect change. As I had mentioned earlier on in the call, we're in the process of delivering what is, I think, an incredibly powerful racial justice program associated with our breakthrough technology. So we are building an equity-based portfolio built around diversity and inclusion. We are also partnered with an organization that allows us to do very specific geographic targeting in individual communities and drive capital back to those communities. So as an example, we've got a pilot program that's launching in the next several months in Minneapolis, St. Paul. whereby we will be able to specifically direct capital down to the neighborhood. So as an example, we may choose women entrepreneurs of color that are seeking investment capital. And so we're bringing that investment alternative into the Newday platform so that all of our institutional contributors and individual clients can participate individually in driving capital back to those communities. In addition to that, as a part of that platform, we are significantly increasing the charitable contribution that we are making to community organizations starting in Minneapolis, St. Paul, to a 20% level above and beyond what is our 5% community pledge as a B corporation. So we're trying to hit this from all angles and really make sure that the work that we're doing is just not about, for lack of a better phrase, greenwashing.
Okay.
That we want capital going directly back to these organizations and community members that are most in need.
Okay, I'm going to turn the systemic risk question to Kimberly, because you have a very different vantage point into this. You engage with long-term investors on behalf of long-term investors. And how do long-term investors see racial justice as a systemic risk, and how do you see that changing? Because they, of course, own assets across the market.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, racism and racial inequality really cuts across all aspects of the economy, which therefore impacts the health and the sustainability of every company. For example, it obviously dampens economic growth and innovation, amplifies climate change risk. We're doing a lot of work looking into that right now. Creates political risk, also potential for civil disorder, as we have seen even recently. And this uncertainty and the inequalities around health, access to health. I mean, there's so many different areas. So when we don't have a healthy economy, when we have civil unrest, when we have increased climate change risk, that is not a healthy environment for long-term shareholders. So it is really underpins the very foundation of what all our investments are built on. So we see that as really it's core to evaluating the long-term strategy of a company, long-term viability of every sector.
And thank you for that. And Melanie, the report that you advised on also makes this point with respect to systemic risk. And I wanted you to weigh in, and then I wanted to turn it over to our audience for questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah. At Matarin, trying to think of the best way to come to this. When you think about the role of getting women into the workforce back in the 60s, which is gone on to today, and now switch that to non-white people of color, getting them into the workforce. We look at it as being underemployed. Now, the assets that we manage are for retirement assets for people who are employed in the public sector. But there's a large population out there who might be working, at corporations, private sector, who may not have access to retirement assets. So we're always trying to find a way to help these communities in terms of, maybe banking or investments. Now, in one of our strategies, we do invest a lot in local and community banks. This is really important because those banks are usually, run by people from the neighborhood and have a more diverse workforce. And it also enables, micro loans for people where they couldn't normally get from a large, bulge bracket bank. They're not going to get the meeting, and they're not even, available to the community itself. Our strategies, we offer negative screening to our clients, and about 50% of the clients do choose a type of investments or companies they do not want their assets allocated to. We're able to do that with no problem within our investment strategy. So that's how we try to manage the risk of the types of companies that we invest in. And then also personally, Matarin personally, we walk the walk in terms of investing or having accounts at the firm level and the personal level at community banks, specifically for that reason, to spread the capital to marginalized communities.
Yeah, and this is emphasizing what Doug said earlier about the importance of the work that you're doing with respect to access to that capital. And this is a statistic on the screen from the report that you advised on, showing just how grim the numbers are. So thank you for your work. Before we move on to audience questions, I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds or so to look into your crystal ball and tell us where are we headed with respect, especially to the investor community looking within. Because as we've all discussed, I think one thing that is perhaps new is folks saying, look, we need to get our own house in order. I'll start with Kimberly on that crystal ball. Do you think the investment community itself is going to start looking within more?
I think it should.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that, Melanie.
Yeah.
You already have. So, but the community as a whole.
Yeah. So the community as a whole. I mean, we are. Matarin has become sort of a thought leader in terms of ESG and racial equity, and this is through my colleague Neely Gilbert, who is out, speaking to, corporations, to Congress, to public pension plans on this particular subject, and investors, not only here in the U.S. but also internationally. So, we need to get people educated and to understand what is going on and how important the role is in spreading the allocation of capital across, the whole country.
Thank you for that. Doug, a quick crystal ball, and then we have a number of really compelling questions that I'd like to save time for.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. And there's a lot of evidence that's building that there are many more people that are paying attention. We work with a number of family offices that have recently put in place a mandate to direct additional capital towards efforts to bring about higher levels of diversity in racial inclusion, which is great to see. The other piece that we need to solve for is around disclosure issues. So there are a lot of analytical organizations that where a company isn't disclosing, they are giving what is a peer group rating on that. So we as an organization don't give a peer group rating, we assign a 0. Because in this day and age, there's just no excuse for non-disclosure of data, regardless of who you are.
I agree with you on that. So let's move on to some of the questions. One that's top of mind for so many is the impact of the ERISA guidance from the Department of Labor. Who would like to address that? Does that mean that fiduciaries can no longer consider ESG? Kimberly, how is Hermes looking at that?
I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to punt on that one.
Okay. Melanie?
Yeah, I'm trying to, since I don't deal with the private sector that much, I really don't have any. We do have a few private sector accounts. But I can't respond to that question.
Okay, just anecdotally, in my discussions, there's been so much data with respect to an alignment between value and values and ESG and alpha that those two things are aligned, and so there's really no conflict, is what I've heard from discussions I've had with investors, but certainly it's a it's a hit to ESG, that's for sure. So let's ask.
And then maybe Amelia, I can just make a comment on that. So there's been no shortage of head scratching moments over the last couple of years. And this is a big one for us, that arguably, given everything that's going on in the world right now and trying to bring about more cohesion in our social circles is critically important. But to be out there and overtly saying that as it pertains to ERISA, that this isn't going to be a mandate is a shame. So I believe that this is still open for public comment, and for everybody that's on this call, especially as an institutional money manager, you should be sending letters into the SEC and voicing your opinion if you feel strongly about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good response, Doug.
Yeah. So this is a question. It might be our last question. Since millennials have such strong and influential purchasing power, how do you see them getting more access to the abilities to engage with companies on ESG issues without owning a few thousand shares in said organization? Well, I think that's where Doug comes in. Check out Newday Impact.
Yeah, and so this is absolutely critical to the work that we do. And you're right. I mean, there have been, some changes that are associated with shareholder rights and voting over the last year. One of the things that we're introducing into the platform is what I'm going to define as a look-alike voting system, whereby our community of users will be sending out information, asking them to weigh in on particular issues of materiality. And the proxy voting system gets incredibly noisy every year, but it will be on bigger issues. So as an example, if an organization has a board of 7 people that's all white, and they're up for vote that are going to a more diverse board of 13, that ends up becoming a material issue, right? And so we're going to garner that sentiment from our community, report it back, and use that as a mechanism as an SEC registered investment advisor and fiduciary to vote our shares in aggregate for our clients, as one example.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's one last question I think is really important because we have so much to learn from other jurisdictions. And this is something that I've chatted about with Kimberly, which is, are there practices from other jurisdictions that shed light on reporting and legislative matters to drive improved performance? Thinking of UK's regulations on ethnicity pay reporting. Kimberly, you're based in the UK, so what do we have to learn?
Yeah. I can say generally, so ethnicity pay gap reporting actually hasn't been enacted yet in the UK. I'm hoping that the current movement will speed up that process. It's been introduced but not enacted. Gender pay gap reporting was introduced and enacted very shortly thereafter. There has been much more of a lag and much more of a difficulty, to be candid, in gaining momentum for ethnicity pay gap legislation. So, however, what we have seen kind of globally is, well, obviously the most, the countries with the 2 most diverse boards, France and Germany, are those that legislatively mandate gender quotas on boards. We're obviously seeing that in the US, actually, with California-based companies and the California legislation and all of the I think it becomes effective, I believe, January 2021. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doug or Melanie. But we're actually seeing companies kind of get their gender composition activity kind of driving up in preparation for that. So I think, generally speaking, I mean, what we're seeing is that the countries where companies have been most progressive are those where it's been legislative or regulatory mandated to do so. I think what companies should learn from that is, if you do not want, obviously, it would be ideal if companies would do it voluntarily and not have to be legislated. And so my counsel would be sort of, see sort of the writing on the wall, and the data supporting the case, and think about basic equity, and take affirmative actions now. That would sort of be, I think, what a reasonable a person or a reasonable leader would do.
Thank you. And in many ways, that correlation is interesting, but of course not surprising, right?
Yeah, yeah. And may I just say one thing to your previous question about what millennials, because I think that's really important.
Yes, of course.
Millennials also have a lot of a lot of leverage because they're the employees, right? And particularly, there's a real competition for talent in a number of sectors, as we're seeing. And the data are showing that millennials what we're telling companies is that business purpose and the perception that a company is doing well for the community is one of is the key driver over even pay for millennials when choosing a company. So I say to millennials, think about, you've got a lot of power in the hiring process, and ask your companies, ask your future employers about what they're doing, read their statements, look at their disclosures, ask in the interviews, and make career decisions accordingly.
Yeah, I'd like to say something to that same question too, along the line for millennials, and that same line, if they're already employed, if they're interviewing for positions, I mean, look at not only their personal investments, but their retirement assets. If they're invested in a 401k, you want to see the full menu of options available to you, and how diverse are the funds that their retirement assets are being invested in. You have a say. You have a say in what gets added to a menu of your 401k assets. And then outside of the retirement assets, millennials, they can search for funds out there that are managed by minority firms or sub-advised by minority firms. You can Morningstar is a great resource to do that type of searching. And then if they want to invest in individual companies, again, they can go at the company level. You can probably go in and get that information before you want to invest. But there are websites out there about where you spend your money to buy your coffee, or buy your athletic gear, whatever it is. You might want to boycott certain. So that that's the way to drive change.
Thank you so much and I'd love to end on that message of millennials and Gen Zers, of course, being the driving force behind advocating for change in our capital markets. Thank you so much for sharing your unique perspectives with us today, Kimberly, Melanie, and Doug, and I hope that we can have many conversations in the years to come. Thank you.